And paste it in our code. And we're going to learn what that is right now. In HTML, there are 3 types of elements. The first type of element is called a block element. A block element takes up the entire line. So a paragraph by default is a block element. We can see that in our DevTools by right-clicking in the browser, and then clicking Inspect, and then clicking this icon in the top left, right here, and then hovering over our paragraph. So you can see that even though the text goes to here, the paragraph extends to the end of the line. Because the property and save and refresh, left, and then hovering over. Like we set the elements where these 2 element space as it needs to and doesn't take up the entire line. An example of an inline block element is the image element and the inline element. Inline elements are basically just text elements. They appear within a line of text. So if you remember, we briefly introduced the element strong. So this element appears within a line of text like this. So this element makes a part of the text bold and it appears within a line of text. So those are the 3 basic types of HTML elements. A block element, which takes a part of the text bold and it appears within a line of text. So those are the 3 entire lines because they determine between block and elements. Let's go into our name. Box inline block element and only take up as much space as they need to.
বিজ্ঞাপন ছাড়া অফলাইনে এবং ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড প্লে সহ ভিডিও দেখুন বিনামূল্যে ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়াম ব্যবহার করে দেখুন। বিজ্ঞাপন ছাড়া অফলাইনে এবং ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড প্লে সহ ভিডিও দেখুন বিনামূল্যে ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়াম ব্যবহার করে দেখুন। ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়ামে নির্বিঘ্নে ভিডিও উপভোগ করুন এবং আপনার যেটা পছন্দ সেটা খুঁজে নিন। এটি আপনার প্রিয় শখ বা সুপ্ত ইচ্ছা যাই হোক না কেন। বিজ্ঞাপন ছাড়া অফলাইনে এবং ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড প্লে সহ ভিডিও দেখুন বিনামূল্যে ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়াম ব্যবহার করে দেখুন। ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়ামে নির্বিঘ্নে ভিডিও উপভোগ করুন এবং আপনার যেটা পছন্দ সেটা খুঁজে নিন। এটি আপনার প্রিয় শখ বা সুপ্ত ইচ্ছা যাই হোক না কেন। বিজ্ঞাপন ছাড়া অফলাইনে এবং ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড প্লে সহ ভিডিও দেখুন। বিনামূল্যে ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়াম ব্যবহার করে দেখুন।
In this lesson, we're going to learn about the most important HTML element called the div element. For example, here's twitter.com. If you look at the HTML that Twitter uses, you can see that they're using lots and lots of divs. Here's another example, Instagram. If we look at Instagram's HTML, we can also see that they're using lots and lots of divs. So what exactly is a div, and why is it used so much? So the div element stands for division, but an easy way to understand this is that the div is just a box. We're going to go into our code and look at an example. So below our paragraphs, let's create a div element. And inside we're going to have some text. This is a div. Save it, and now we have our first div element on the page. To show you that the div is just a box, we're going to right click and inspect, and then we're going to click this top left icon and hover over the div. So as you can see, we created a box around our text. You'll notice that this box stretches to the end, and that's because the div, like the paragraph, by default is a block element, so it takes up the entire line. But like we learned in the previous lesson, we can easily change this to an inline block using the display property. So let's go ahead and do that, and it'll be more clear that this is really a box. So we're going to set a class here. We're going to call this div-example. And now we're going to style it and change the display to inline block so that it doesn't take up the entire line anymore. Save it. And now if we go to our web page, click this icon and hover over, you can clearly see that the div just creates a box around our content. In this case, our content is some text. So that's basically what a div is. Now the second question is, why is a div so useful? The key feature of a div is that it can contain any other elements inside. So right now we only have some text.
বিজ্ঞাপন ছাড়া অফলাইনে এবং ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড প্লে সহ ভিডিও দেখুন বিনামূল্যে ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়াম ব্যবহার করে দেখুন।
Is why is a div so useful? The key feature of a div is that it can contain any other elements inside. So right now we only have some text inside this div, but we can actually put paragraphs. Of a div is that it can contain any other. So that's basically what a div is. Now the second question is, our content is some text. It just creates a box around our content. In this case, our content, you can clearly see that the div just creates a box around our content. In this case, our content is some text. So that's basically what a div is. Now the second question is, why is a div so useful? Just create the clear that this is really a div-example and change the, we're going to call this, we're going to style it example. And now we're going to style it and change the display.
বিজ্ঞাপন ছাড়া অফলাইনে এবং ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড প্লে সহ ভিডিও দেখুন বিনামূল্যে ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়াম ব্যবহার করে দেখুন।
Display to inline block so that it doesn't take up the entire line anymore. Save it, and now if we go to our web page, click this icon and hover over, you can clearly see that the div just creates a box around our content. In this case, our content is some text. So that's basically what a div is. Now the second question is, why is a div so useful? The key feature of a div is that it can contain any other elements inside. So right now we only have some text inside this div, but we can actually put paragraphs, we can put images, we can put any elements inside divs as well as other divs. Divs are meant to be containers. And if we look at the YouTube design that we have in our project, we use containers everywhere. So here's a container, here's another container, and here's another container. These containers allow us to group all of these elements together so that we can create a layout that looks like this. Here's another example from Twitter. Here's a container, here's another container, and here's another container. In order to build a complex real-world website, we need containers to group our elements together and lay them out on the page. And the div is the perfect solution for this container problem. And that's why it's used so much. Let's go back to our website. and we're going to practice using our div as a container. So we're going to create a container, just like our final project, for this entire video preview here. So that means we're going to put all of these elements, this image and all 3 paragraphs, inside our div. Let's see how that works. So I'm going to get rid of this text first, and then I'm going to change this div to a class of video-preview, because this is going to contain all these elements that are part of a video preview. And then I'm going to move the image and the 3 paragraphs into the div. Now save. And you might not notice any difference because the div is simply just drawing a box around the content inside. But we can right click and inspect, and we can see the div in our HTML here. And inside the div, we have our image and our paragraphs. The div is just creating a box around all this content. So now I'll show you why containers are so useful. We're going to go into our code, and we're going to change the width of our div element here. So we're going to go up here and we can remove this. Let's style the video preview class. And we're going to set a width of 300 pixels. Let's see how that looks. So the page doesn't look any different, but if we click the icon in the top left and then hover over our paragraphs, we'll notice something interesting. This paragraph is a block element, so it's supposed to take up the entire line. But in this case, because this paragraph
বিজ্ঞাপন ছাড়া অফলাইনে এবং ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড প্লে সহ ভিডিও দেখুন বিনামূল্যে ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়াম ব্যবহার করে দেখুন।
Graph is inside a div, it takes up the entire line in the div. So the way that block elements actually work is that they take up the entire line in their container rather than on the page. So that's really useful because if we look at our final project, so for these paragraphs, we want them to appear on separate lines like this. So we do want them to take up their own line, but we don't necessarily want them to take up the line on the entire page because we have some stuff on the right side here. So to solve this problem, we put the paragraphs inside a container so that they take up their own line in the container and not in the page. And that's how we can create a layout like this. Let's go back to our website. If we hover over our div now, so this blue box on the left is our container. It groups all the elements together and keeps it within that blue area that you see. Now a really The cool thing about this is that notice that the blue box doesn't actually take up the entire page. So we can actually have a second box beside it on the right. So we can add another blue box on the right containing another video preview. So now we're going to do that. But first of all, a div by default is a block element. So notice on the right side, it's all orange. That's because this div is taking up the entire line. In this case, we don't want it to take up the entire line anymore. That's why we're going to convert it into an inline block element. So let's go into our code. We're going to go into the video preview and we're going to type display inline block. Let's save it. And now you can see that our div is a display inline block. It's actually appearing beside our search bar because this is also an inline block. So
ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়ামে নির্বিঘ্নে ভিডিও উপভোগ করুন এবং আপনার যেটা পছন্দ সেটা খুঁজে নিন। এটি আপনার প্রিয় শখ বা সুপ্ত ইচ্ছা যাই হোক না কেন। বিজ্ঞাপন ছাড়া অফলাইনে এবং ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড প্লে সহ ভিডিও দেখুন। বিনামূল্যে ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়াম ব্যবহার করে দেখুন।
So they're both only taking up as much space as they need to, and now they can appear beside each other. However, we do want the search box to be at the top in its own line. So we're going to practice using the display property again. We're going to set the search bar to display block so that it takes up the entire line and everything else is forced below it. Save it and refresh. And now if we hover over this input element, we can hit it and refresh, and everything else is forced below. It. Save it and refresh. And now if we hover over this input element, we can see that we forced it to take up the entire line. Input element, save it and refresh. And now if if we hover over below it in its own line. So we're going to practice using the display property again. We're going to set the search bar to display block so that it takes up the entire line and everything else is forced below it. Save it and refresh. And now if we hover over this input element, we can see that we forced it to take up the entire line. Next, we're going to create another video preview beside this one. Because this is inline block now, we can put another div here. So I'm just going to simplify this by making a copy of our current code. I'm just going to copy and paste. And now we have two video previews. Save it. And there we go. We now have two video previews beside each other. So they are
ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়ামে আপনার যেটা পছন্দ সেটা খুঁজে নিন। বিজ্ঞাপন ছাড়া অফলাইনে এবং ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড প্লে সহ ভিডিও দেখুন। বিনামূল্যে ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়াম ব্যবহার করে দেখুন। বিজ্ঞাপন ছাড়া অফলাইনে এবং ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড প্লে সহ ভিডিও দেখুন। বিনামূল্যে ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়াম ব্যবহার করে দেখুন।
Are two containers right beside each other. And remember, in our CSS, we set the width of these containers to 300 pixels. So that's the amount of space that they take. And we set their display to inline block. So they don't take up the entire line and they can appear beside each other. And now we're on our the don't take up, set the width of these containers to 300 pixels. So that's the amount of space that they take. And we set their display to inline block. So they don't take up the entire line and they can appear beside each other. And now we're on our way to creating a layout that looks like this. In fact, let's actually replace the second video preview here with this content. So to do that, we're going to download the thumbnail and then change the text.
বিজ্ঞাপন ছাড়া অফলাইনে এবং ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড প্লে সহ ভিডিও দেখুন বিনামূল্যে ইউটিউব প্রিমিয়াম ব্যবহার করে দেখুন।
So let's right click and inspect. I'm going to click this top left and then click this image. And now I can download the thumbnail by going to this URL and then clicking down here. I'm going to Control S to save the thumbnail. I'm going to save it in the folder that contains my code in the thumbnails folder, along with our previous thumbnail. So save it here, and I should see it in my code editor right there. Next, we're going to swap out the thumbnails. So instead of thumbnail 1, we're going to set thumbnail 2, and we're going to change the text. So I'm going to change this text here to be my title. And I notice we're still using the strong element, which we can now delete because it was just for an example. And I'm also going to change the channel name here. This piece of text here wraps around to a second line while this one does not. However, to make it look better, we want to align these at the top. So we learned this way back in one of the earlier lessons, and we're going to review how to do that. We're going to go into our code, and we just have to set this property, vertical align. And we're going to set it to top, so that these elements align at the top. I'm going to save it, and now that looks pretty good. Lessons, and we're going to review while this one together. So now, and 4 years ago. So now if I save this, we have 2 different video previews. Does not. So we learned this way back in one of the earlier lessons, and we just have to set this property, vertical align. And we're going to set it to top, so that these elements this way back in one of the earlier lessons, and we're going to review how to do it. Vertical looks pretty. So remember the space. We're going to add margin dash right. Entire container right now. Pixel. And now the interesting thing about this is if we right click and inspect, and then in our HTML we find our div, which is here. You'll see that the margin is applied on the entire div. So that's how the div element works. It's a container type right now. So margin. That looks at the In our HTML, we find our div, which is here. You'll see that the margin is applied on the entire higher div. So that's how the div element works. It's a container that groups other elements together so that we can create complex layouts like on the right click element. We just have to set this property. I'm going to swap out the thumbnails. So instead of code, say click, do vertical. We're gonna
Once everything's perfectly organized, I'll start working on my thesis.
Grammarly will
this and eventually our YouTube project. That group div. So that's how the div element works. It's a container that groups other elements together so that we can create complex layouts like this and eventually our YouTube project.